Hello, this is Dr. Grande. Today's question is, can I analyze the case of Brian Drake? Just a reminder, I'm not diagnosing anybody in this video, only speculating about what could be happening in a situation like this. If you enjoyed this video, please like it, subscribe to my channel, and consider supporting me on Patreon. I will put the link to Patreon in the description for this video. First, I'll look at the background of this case, move to the timeline of the crime, then offer my analysis. Brian Drake was born on October 29, 1974, in Corpus Christi, Texas. He was raised in Jackson, Mississippi. After college, he moved to Montana, where he met a woman named Jennifer at a church. The couple married in 1999. They moved to Texas, where Brian studied to be a chiropractor. He opened up his own clinic. The couple started a family. Eventually, they had 4 children, 3 boys and a girl. In 2012, the family moved to Idaho to be closer to Jennifer's relatives. Brian ran his own practice out of 2 locations. One was in the small town of Bonners Ferry, which is in Boundary County, the northernmost county in Idaho. Brian had an office at 6811 South Main Street. It only had 2 rooms, an exam room and a waiting room. Now moving to the timeline of the crime. On Thursday, March 12, 2020, 45-year-old Brian Drake was working in his office in Bonners Ferry. After finishing up with his last patient for the day, Brian was seated in the exam room talking with his wife on his cell phone. The phone call started at 7:17 p.m. At 7:26 p.m., Brian complained to Jennifer that he was in pain. He thought that maybe he had been struck by a bullet. A few seconds later, he stopped responding to Jennifer, and she called 911. A person who lived across the street from the office also called 911. Based on the way the 2 calls were routed, the second call was actually received by the police first. It came in at 7:29 p.m. When the police arrived at the scene, they found Brian Drake dead on the floor of the exam room. He had been shot 1 time in the back with a small caliber weapon. The bullet traveled through the window of his office as he was seated with his back to the window. The window blinds were closed when he was shot. The neighbor who called 911 saw a person moving away from the scene of the shooting, but was unable to identify them. The police found surveillance video that captured a white Toyota Tundra pickup truck in the vicinity of the homicide around the time of the shooting. The pickup truck matched the description of one owned by a 62-year-old chiropractor named Daniel Lee Moore. He ran a competing practice from an office on the same street as Brian Drake. On video surveillance, the Toyota Tundra can be seen circling the area. It did this 2 times. After that, the pickup truck drove into the alley between Brian Drake's office building and the building next to it. This placed the truck directly outside the window where the shooting occurred. After stopping for several seconds, the truck then went north on Main Street and parked. A human figure could be seen exiting the pickup truck and walking toward Brian's office. It appeared as though the operator locked the vehicle because the taillights flashed. This was only a minute and a half before the shooting. At 7:26 p.m., when the shooting occurred, a human figure could be seen walking and then running back to the pickup truck. The taillights flashed as if it was unlocked. The truck then drove to the residence of a man named Mick Mellett, who only lived a few hundred feet away. 5 minutes later, the truck can be seen leaving Mick's house and driving using an indirect route toward Daniel's house, as if the operator was trying to avoid the crime scene. The police spoke to Daniel Moore about the mysterious movements of the Toyota Tundra. He told officers that on the night of the murder, he was at Mick's house. When he was there, he developed diarrhea. This motivated him to drive to his office in search of medicine. When he was unsuccessful, Daniel returned to Mick's house for Imodium. This is where he was located when he received the call about the shooting of Brian Drake. The police asked Daniel why his pickup truck was captured in the alley next to Brian Drake's office building. Daniel explained that he had entered the alley to make a deposit, so to speak. This was consistent with his intestinal distress story. The police didn't find this convincing. It was clear that Daniel's story did not smell right. 3 days after Brian was murdered, there was a gas leak in the office of Daniel Moore. His friend Mick had passed the office on his way to breakfast and noticed that Daniel's pickup truck was in the parking lot. When he returned home, the pickup truck was still there. This was unusual for a Sunday. Mick decided to use his key to enter Daniel's office. Inside, he discovered Daniel getting up from an exam table. Daniel appeared to be woozy. Mick took Daniel outside and reported the gas leak. Daniel explained that he had entered his office to change the filter for the furnace when he was overcome by the gas. This rendered him unconscious. He explained his failure to detect the gas by saying that he had lost his sense of smell. When firefighters arrived, they noticed a gas fitting that was not very tight. This was the cause of the leak. Investigators developed a theory. They believed that Daniel was the killer, and the gas leak was designed to bring an end to his own life because he felt guilty about the murder. Several months after the murder, on August 27, 2020, the police asked Daniel to bring his wife's pistol to the police station so they could test the weapon. The police knew that this gun was not the murder weapon. This was just a tactic to get Daniel to the police station. When Daniel brought the weapon in, the police engaged in small talk with him as the gun was being tested. They asked him if he would answer a few more questions. They took Daniel to what they referred to as a secure area and told him he needed to be checked for weapons. They grabbed his car keys as part of this process. Daniel's cell phone was in his vehicle. The interview started at 2:49 p.m. It didn't take long for the police to accuse Daniel of murdering Brian. Daniel Moore denied being involved in the murder. At 2:53 p.m., one of the officers said, quote, "I need to advise you of your Miranda rights, too, just because we are in a police station," unquote. The officer then explained how if Daniel had blindly fired through the window, it would not be considered first-degree murder. Daniel once again denied being the shooter, but the officers kept demanding that he explain his intent. Daniel replied, quote, "Well, I didn't shoot him, and I'm sorry, but that's what it is. So I guess if you're going to do that, then I need to get an attorney," unquote. The investigators left the room at 3:05 p.m. and debated about whether Daniel had actually requested an attorney. This was peculiar considering he had used the phrase, "I need to get an attorney." There really wasn't any ambiguity. It sounds like the police were desperate to find a way to continue the interview no matter what. 41 minutes later, another officer named Assistant Chief Marty Ryan entered the room with Daniel and started asking him questions. 40 minutes into this interview, Daniel said, quote, "I need to talk to an attorney then," unquote. The officer pretended as if he was uncertain as to what Daniel wanted to do. Marty eventually said, "You want to talk to me or not? Yes or no?" Daniel said, "I think I need to talk to an attorney." Marty Ryan stood up to leave, but before he exited, Daniel said, "So what do I do?" In the following conversation, Marty suggested that he wanted the truth from Daniel. He promised Daniel that he wouldn't get booked for first-degree murder. Eventually, Daniel said, quote, "I want to talk to somebody using my legal rights," unquote. A few seconds later, he added, quote, "That doesn't mean I don't want to talk to you," unquote. Marty left the room and other officers entered. Daniel said, "Can I talk to Ryan one more time?" Marty Ryan entered the room again and told Daniel that the police knew he was guilty, and without his confession, he would be charged with first-degree murder. Eventually, Daniel said, quote, "I did not go there to murder him," unquote. And then he confessed to murdering Brian Drake. Daniel Moore was charged with second-degree murder and the use of a deadly weapon in the commission of a felony. On October 30, 2020, he was released on bail and resumed his practice as a chiropractor. In April of 2021, Daniel's defense challenged the validity of the confession. The court found that the confession was coerced, and Daniel's Miranda rights were violated. The confession was ruled inadmissible. The criminal charges against Daniel Moore were dismissed on August 31, 2022. The state appealed to the Supreme Court of Idaho. They argued that the district court was correct when it said that Daniel's Miranda rights were violated, but the district court made a mistake when it declared that the confession was coerced. This is important because the state intended to refile the charges against Daniel someday, if possible. They wanted to make sure that if he testified at a preliminary hearing or at his trial, his confession could be used to impeach his credibility. The state argued that an illegally obtained confession should not give a defendant a license to perjure himself at trial. The state was successful. The Supreme Court of Idaho ruled that the confession was not coerced. This puts Daniel Moore in a tough position. There's not a lot of evidence against him right now, but if that changes and he is charged with murder, his legal tactics will be limited. He could still testify in his own defense and deny committing the murder, but that would allow the state to use the confession to expose his deception. Even though Daniel may be clear for now as far as the criminal case, he is still facing a civil case filed by the family of Brian Drake. Now moving to my analysis. Daniel Moore maintains his innocence, and there are many people who believe that he had nothing to do with the murder of Brian Drake. This case has led to several conspiracy theories involving law enforcement. Their incompetent handling of the interview gave people a lot of ammunition against them. The state, of course, believes that Daniel Moore is guilty. They just don't have enough evidence to support that theory without the confession. This brings me to the question, was Daniel Moore guilty of murder? Let's take a look at the evidence both for and against the idea that he was guilty, starting with the inculpatory factors. Daniel Moore and Brian Drake were both chiropractors who worked on the same street. Bonners Ferry is a small town. It's hard to imagine that there was a tremendous demand for chiropractors. Maybe Daniel wanted to restrict the competition's range of motion permanently. Daniel's pickup truck was captured on video surveillance, driving in the area of Brian's office at around the time of the murder. The human figure seen exiting his vehicle was almost certainly Daniel. The truck drove in the alley next to Brian's office building. The truck then parked nearby. A human figure could be seen walking toward Brian's office right before the shooting and leaving right after the shooting. The truck then went to a house occupied by a friend of Daniel's. When the truck left that house, it went in the direction of Daniel's house using an indirect route. Daniel's explanation for this strange behavior was intestinal distress. Yet there are many restrooms available in this area. Why would he choose an alley? 3 days after the murder, Daniel had a mysterious gas leak in his office. The cause was a gas fitting that received an adjustment. Daniel confessed to the murder. It was ruled inadmissible, but it was not coerced. Moving to the exculpatory factors, no physical evidence ties Daniel to the murder. No DNA, no fingerprints, no gunshot residue. Daniel did not know Brian. It seems strange that he would murder him out of nowhere. No murder weapon was ever recovered. In theory, any number of people could be responsible for the murder. Just because Daniel was in the area acting suspiciously doesn't mean that he was the shooter. As far as the confession, even though the court said it was not coerced, maybe it was coerced in reality. When considering the evidence, do I think that Daniel Moore is guilty? In my opinion, he's probably guilty in reality, but he's not guilty beyond a reasonable doubt. Without the confession, the state's case is weak. I think this is one of those odd situations where everybody knows who committed the crime, but nothing can be done to pursue justice. What do I think happened in this case? This is just a theory, my opinion. Daniel Moore viewed Brian Drake as a pain in the neck because Brian was competition. For some reason, Daniel reached a boiling point on March 12, 2020. He drove his pickup truck into the alley next to Brian's office building and looked at or through the window. He knew Brian was in there. Maybe he could see a shadow, or he could see through the gaps in the blinds. He parked his pickup truck nearby, walked up to the window, fired a single shot, and left. Daniel somehow disposed of the murder weapon and escaped responsibility. The problem is, he could not escape his guilt and shame. He caused a gas leak in his office to make his exit, but his effort was interrupted by a friend. He sent mixed messages to the police during an interview, which prompted them to violate his rights and illegally obtain a confession. Daniel was able to win a legal victory to exclude the confession as evidence, but it still haunts him in the form of restricting his tactics in the future if he is charged again. Now moving to my final thoughts. Daniel Moore is in a tough place as far as looking guilty. his back is against the wall. The weight of his alleged involvement will never be lifted from his shoulders. He will always need to watch his back and bend over backward not to supply the state with new evidence. No matter how much he stretches the truth, his manipulation will never get his story into alignment with reality. Fortunately for Daniel, the state's painful mistake will probably keep him out of the joint. Those are my thoughts on the case of Brian Drake. Please put any opinions and thoughts in the comment section. They always generate an interesting dialogue. As always, I hope you found my analysis of this topic to be informative. Thanks for watching.